Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We have a special guest from India with us today. Professor Harsh Pant is the Director for Strategic Study Programs at the Observer Research Foundation in India. The ORF is one of the premier think tanks in India. Professor Pant, welcome, and thank you for spending some time with us. What we normally do is ask you to just talk a little bit about yourself, your background, where you are, and a little bit about the ORF, please, if you wouldn't mind.
I'm at the moment with Observer Research Foundation, as you mentioned. I am also a professor at King's College London, so I teach there. I'm a professor of international relations, and have been on sabbatical from King's for the last 2 years, and going into my third year, and directing research at Observer Research Foundation in Delhi. ORF, of course, is India's at the moment largest think tank, and I think our premier conference is the Raisina Dialogue that we hold every year in January, which we have been doing for the last 4 years. This will be I think January 2020 will be the 5th iteration of that. I think the fact that we do this in collaboration with MEA, and Mr. Modi has been a strong supporter of the Raisina Dialogue, means that it allows ORF to be a stakeholder in the kind of conversations that are happening around the world on India, on the region, on regional geopolitics and geoeconomics, as well as on what role India aspires for itself, as well as the expectations that the world has of India. So I think in that sense, I'm also a small part of that journey. Of course, being a scholar, I work on book projects. So there are a number of projects that I've done recently, and I'm looking forward to doing, including some on Indian foreign policy, some on regional geopolitics, some on the engagement of external players in the region.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's wonderful. I wanted to touch on the books that you've written, and the latest one you've written is the Indian Foreign Policy, the Modi Era, and that was launched in April 2019. And, if you wouldn't mind just expanding just a little bit on that book, but also, what in your opinion really defines the Modi government and the Modi foreign policy?
I think the book that that came out is basically a collection of a series of writings that I had done over the past 5 years, and the idea was to bring together, in some ways, my understanding of what Modi government has been able to achieve, or some of the challenges that it faced over the past 5 years. How Modi's engagement with the world evolved as he grew into the role of the Prime Minister from 2014 all the way to 2019. And I think it tells you a story about his foreign policy that goes beyond the sort of sophomoric debate that we have been having about his foreign policy. Some saying, oh, it's only about style and not substance, whereas others saying, oh, something fundamental is changing. Clearly, I think not only has his style been different from his predecessors, but substantively, I think he has been able to inject a sense of dynamism into Indian foreign policy, which was missing. And I think he did a couple of things which are quite interesting. One, his ability to communicate with the ordinary Indians is remarkable. We have not had a politician of his kind in recent history. And that allows him to bring foreign policy discourse into our day-to-day conversations. So it allows an ordinary Indian to connect with what the Prime Minister is doing and with what his government is doing in terms of foreign policy, which is quite unique, because not many people are interested in day-to-day visits of the Prime Minister, where he's going. But I think because he's a constant communicator through various media that he uses, from Twitter all the way to radio, I think he has been able to generate a sense of enthusiasm around Indian foreign policy.
Can you just expand a little bit on your thoughts about the Indian diaspora and how the Modi government has worked with the Indian diaspora, and what that has created back home in India, in as far as policy is concerned with other countries, and how India has utilized the diaspora?
Well, I think this has been one of the bigger success stories of the Modi government. I mean, if you would recall that it was Mr. Vajpayee's government that first talked about how important diaspora can be. But somewhere between Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh, it got lost. The emphasis on the diaspora got lost, although we started having this regular NRI summits, but they seemed more superficial than anything substantive. But I think what Mr. Modi was able to do, two things. One, of course, there was a lot of enthusiasm from Mr. Modi himself. So his personality is very powerful, and people love him. He has this almost a rock star-like status wherever he goes. And that I think for an ordinary Indian, whether he's in Washington, whether it is in Kenya, or whether he's in or she's in Australia, I think the connect with the Prime Minister directly is, I think, quite inspiring, and that allows them to participate in the political process in ways that perhaps they would not conceive of in a different setup. So with Mr. Modi, I think that bridge could be traversed, and the fact that he could that he could appeal to their sense of national pride, as you put it, also meant that he could involve a lot of these communities into the Indian developmental story. So when he says that, look, we need resources from you to clean the Ganges, I think clean Ganga, Swachh Ganga Abhiyan, I think that is a very powerful symbol that, look, you have the resources, we don't, domestic government may not have, so why don't you invest there? And I think why don't you come and give something in return? And that's a sentiment, I think, that the diaspora everywhere is very keen to invest, is very keen to participate in that story, but it has been the failure of New Delhi to reach out to them. I think with Mr. Modi, the fact that he reaches out is quite a morale booster. So you then see that the Prime Minister himself is championing your cause. He's reaching out to you wherever he goes. He makes it a point to meet the diaspora during his foreign policy visits, and I think that has created an atmosphere whereas diaspora has become such an integral part of rising India, and the fact that they are, they feel a sense of pride in the India story adds to this momentum, and I think back home now there is a sense that you need to cultivate the diaspora. And you need to cultivate it in substantive terms, whereby whether it is the economic growth story of India, or be it the domestic socio-cultural engagement. If you're not leveraging diaspora, you are missing out on a very important instrumentality of India's power, which is India's soft power, which is India's latent power, and I think that is something that we have seen his government do very, very substantively.
Talking about experiences here in Australia, India is 29 states, and it's very divided in that way. When I hear people of Indian origin outside of India, and I have dialogue with them, it's very much, I'm Gujarati, I'm Marathi, I'm from Tamil Nadu, I'm from Andhra Pradesh, I'm etc., etc. They traditionally say the state that they're from, as opposed to, hey, I'm Indian. Now, I think that needs to change if we're going to, win that soft diplomacy. What's next for the Indian government? What do they need to do to actually, continue to harness the strength and the soft power of the diaspora?
And one of the most important things, I think, is that if you expect the diaspora to become part of India's developmental story, then I think you need to create an environment where they also find it easier. See, you can always appeal to the sense of national pride, but it won't last for very long because it's an emotional sentiment. They love their country, and of course they would be willing to invest there. But ultimately, it's a question of whether they find an environment which is conducive to achieving the kind of potential that they think that is there in India. So a lot of these issues are about basic issues of governance, whether we can get the basics of our governance right in India, so that you can then allow these these stakeholders to be much more integral part of that narrative. And a lot of this, I think, will be achieved in the coming years, which I think in terms of how do you shape the institutional frameworks in the country, regulatory frameworks, how do you shape the larger ecosystem whereby even someone who may not have lots of resources, but he will have or she will have a degree of conviction, and with limited resources, what can he or she do for the country? So it may not, you are not necessarily targeting the big guns, if you will. You are also targeting even an ordinary Indian who feels that a sense of pride in the country, and who feels that he or she can contribute in their own ways. So what are the avenues you are creating for them, rather than just going for the niche, big players in the market? I think that there is a recognition that this needs to change and this needs to evolve. But whether India can do it fast enough, effectively enough, and in areas where traditionally we don't think of leveraging these resources. So I think a lot of the policy programs that India is now talking about, Digital India, Startup India, Clean India, even the conservation of rivers and forests. You have so much talent which is outside, which can be tapped into. Absolutely. And which it would be very easy to harness. But because the frameworks are such that we do not allow them to be that easily being tapped into, I think we need to be cognizant of those challenges. We need a sort of a argument around Indian identity. And I think Mr. Modi is well placed to do it. I mean, after all, the kind of he's got a kind of mandate which cuts across caste lines, which cuts across regional lines. So he can sort of mobilize them. But I think you can also look at the other way around, that India is today also involved in a lot of state level projects. So you have state governments that are also going out and asking for resources. They are also going out and competing for investment. I think positive competition among states is always very healthy. So if you can have a situation where even if, for example, I'm a Gujarati and the Gujarat government comes to me and says, well, you are a Gujarati, do something for me, I think we should welcome that. Yes, you can always have an expectation that you would invest in India and in areas irrespective of your state identity. But I think even if the state identity can be leveraged positively for certain states, and I think there are certain states that have done very well. There are certain states that are in dire need of this investment. So you have today states like West Bengal, which need infrastructure investment. Northeast needs so much investment. And I think the vision of the Prime Minister being that he wants to connect Northeast to the larger Southeast Asia, you need to develop that part of the country. And I think that is something that can be easily done, even if you are using the sort of regional identity. Orissa, West Bengal, and the entire eastern belt. Absolutely. That can be tapped into. So
the ORF has worked extensively with Australian organisations, and you spoke at one this afternoon, the Lowy Institute. So there's a relationship there. In your view, and the conversations you have within ORF, and before you actually came on to this visit, what were the thoughts behind the people in ORF on the ground in India as to the Australia-India relationship? Where is it now at the moment?
I think with Australia, there has always been the case that much more can happen, and there is so much potential. Why are we failing to tap into that? And on some aspects, there is there is a question of misperception. Are we looking at each other differently? From our vantage points, sitting in Delhi, we look at Canberra, and sitting in Canberra, we look at New Delhi, and are our expectations of each other divergent from each other? So I think at one level, it's a question of are we in sync in terms of our expectations from the relationship? Is Australia expecting something and India expecting something else from this relationship? And I think the conversation on this has started, and conversation is in the right direction, but I think that much more needs to be done. The other aspect is that there is no shying away from the China factor. And when China comes into the mix, again the question is, do we understand each other when it comes to China? And I think there is still a perception in India that look, Australia has this massive economic relationship with China, and there was this unfortunate thing that happened with the quadrilateral initiative the first time, when it got derailed, partly because of the perception that Australia was not interested in it, and Australia did not want to annoy the Chinese. So there is a sense that given that for Australia stakes are so high, will it ever be comfortable with the kind of relationship that India would want out of the Chinese? Now, of course, you cannot make a third party contingent on your bilateral relationship, but when it comes to China, almost all the framing around it, whether you're looking at it, the quadrilateral initiative, whether you're looking at the military exercises, the way it is framed can often matter. And I think there, perhaps many in India also need to understand what is happening here, which I think is not done often enough. So the fact that Australia's discussion on China has evolved very, very significantly in the last 2-3 years.
Yes, correct.
Which I think not many in India understand. They still are, there's still, when you mention Australia, there is always this easy way out. All right, there's this Australia-China relationship. What can we do? They are always conservative. But I think Australia has evolved, and India under Modi has evolved. And I think both of these evolutions need to be understood, and both of these evolutions need to be tapped into. I don't think it's happening at a rate where it should, at which it should, but largely the conversations have become more positive, and I think the conversations are moving in a direction where you are also talking of, rather than looking everything through the prism of history, you are also looking at more pragmatic, issue-based engagement.